if I haven't created the skill of mobilizing or emotional expression or vocalizing, I don't have any new ways to process this. And now I'm retelling it, I'm reliving it, I'm just going to get the same patterned response. I'm going to recreate the repression. I'm going to recreate the whole neurotag. My filters of the world might start to change. I'll have that activation inside and I don't have any way to process it. And so I'm essentially then just re-traumatizing myself over and over and over again.
I have such a rich episode for you today. Today, I got to really nerd out with Elisabeth Kristof, who is the co-host of the Trauma Rewired podcast, which is one of the top-ranking Apple podcasts that explores complex trauma. And we went so deep on the nervous system. Elisabeth works with people to really understand that every single thing they do is as a result of their nervous system, which is their body's operating system, trying to keep them safe. She works with entrepreneurs, athletes, and high performers of all kinds to increase their resiliency, emotional regulation, and ability to show up fully and presently in their life. Her own story of healing is absolutely miraculous, going from an eating disorder and all sorts of different results of having adverse childhood experiences to creating a business that is thriving, absolutely thriving, and helping thousands of people around the world to tap into the power of their nervous system to show up fully. In today's episode, we talk about money and the nervous system, the misunderstandings we have around mindset, some of her concerns around the way somatics and the nervous system is portrayed in social media, and so much more. Listen in, and you are going to be absolutely blown away by the information in this episode. Enjoy. Welcome to Plenty. I'm your host, Kate Northrup, and together we are going on a journey to help you have an incredible relationship with money, time, and energy, and to have abundance on every possible level. Every week, we're going to dive in with experts and insights to help you unlock a life of plenty. Let's go fill our cups.
Please note that the opinions and perspectives of the guests on the Plenty podcast are not necessarily reflective of the opinions and perspectives of Kate Northrup or anyone who works within the Kate Northrup brand.
Hi, Elisabeth.
Hey.
Thanks for being here.
I'm so honored to be here and so excited to have this conversation. Thank you.
We are gonna nerd out.
Yes, we are.
Excited. Okay. So one of the things that I have found fascinating, and I'm curious your take on this, when I started learning about the nervous system and trauma, really, but more specifically the nervous system, I read a book called Patriarchy, Stress Disorder by Dr. Valerie Rain. And then I read The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And as I was reading, I was like, gosh, this is so interesting, because I was so deeply fascinated and I became somewhat obsessed, I would say. And I thought I thought that was odd, because I would not identify as someone who actually has a lot of, like if I were to take the ACE, if you were to look at my history,
Yes.
the ACE, the adverse childhood experiences, like my score wouldn't be particularly high. So my question is for you, like in the experience you've had with all these, hundreds, thousands of people that you've worked with, and now you've trained all of these people too. Why do you think people get so obsessed with the nervous system? Do we always have to have a history of intense trauma or not?
I don't think we have to at all. I mean, our nervous system is our operating system. Our brain and our nervous system drive our behavior, our health, our mental health. And I think we should want to know how we work and why things are happening. And even if we don't have typical like high ACE score, high levels of trauma, we live in a pretty dysregulating world. It's not set up to be really conducive for nervous system health. And so there are also big structural things. Like you were talking about the patriarchy and systemic racism and oppression and all of these constructs, emotional repression that runs through our society. And so even if in our family unit, in our individual lives, we don't have a huge trauma history, we're still living in a society that has a big impact on our nervous system. And I think for so many people, when we start to learn about this and connect these dots of like, oh, this is a root behind my anxiety, or this is a root behind my pain. It's like, why didn't somebody tell me this sooner? Why didn't I know more about this? And then it's really this journey of really knowing yourself, like at that deep, deep level, know thyself. What makes my system run better? What makes my brain function better? What makes me feel more present and alive? And I think we want to know ourselves at that deep level.
What are some of the biggest misunderstandings people have about being a high performer and what it takes to be a high performer and the route to get there?
I mean, I work with a lot of high performers, and I don't want to broadly generalize here, right? Because everybody's different. Everyone's nervous system is different. But a lot of what makes us really successful, and I was someone who performed pretty well in life, and a lot of that success comes from some dysregulation. There's perfectionism and this need to constantly be doing, trouble resting and in stillness. And so a lot of times we can be really successful externally, but there's an internal cost to that high stress state. And a lot of times too, for kiddos who do have a high ACE score, we learn a lot to perform really well, to mask our emotions, our needs, and, be doing all of these things externally to create that sense of safety. But it's at a cost of regulation and an internal sense of safety. So I'm like trying to manufacture it outside, and that is successful for a while.
Right.
But there's usually a back end cost to that later.
And that's like either a later back end cost that can be seen, but certainly a back end cost that can be felt by the individual.
Yeah.
Which is something that our society doesn't really talk about enough. We're like always focused on the external success of like, did they make money? Did they raise through the ranks? Did they have all the achievements? Does their house look right? They have the right, partner. Do they have the right amount of kids? Drive the right car? Like, right. And those are all the kind of like success things.
Checking the boxes.
When underneath
there's, worst case scenario, there's like disease later, autoimmune, cancer, these things that show up after years and years of dysregulation, chronic pain. There's mental health consequences, but without even those big ends of the spectrum, there's an emotional numbness, like an inability to really feel and process our emotions. There's a lot of behaviors. So like things looked pretty good on the outside, and I was binge eating all of the time in a really painful way. I couldn't really have intimacy with people. I was a real deal workaholic and would just cycle through my life in these periods of big exertion, big output, and then crash with a binge, with a migraine. And it was just rinse and repeat. And you're never really present. You're never really living an embodied life. And that's a huge cost. That's a huge cost.
When did you start to learn about the nervous system? How did this work come into your life?
So I started originally down the road of applied neuro. I had some movement studios in Austin, and we were focused on athletic performance and chronic pain, and knew I wanted to bring neurology into that, brain science. I knew that was the future of movement science. So I started studying probably in around 2010, and that took me down a long road of education in neuro. It wasn't really until I had my own experience of life kind of falling apart. It was a really high stress time. And in that high stress time, that's when I got sober at a pretty early age. My adolescence was like pretty volatile. But once I got sober, stopped drinking alcohol, things kind of evened out, looked successful on the outside, but there were still all these patterns underneath. And that kind of collapsed down around me in 2018. And at that time, all of this unresolved childhood trauma also started to trickle up to the surface, and really started going down the path of somatics, reading all the books that you mentioned, Body Keeps the Score, learning about complex trauma. And I just kept seeing this connection between everything that I'd learned about the brain and the nervous system in my applied neuroeducation, and how that was so integral to the things I was learning in the world of somatics, and how they could be woven together in this way that could be really powerful. And that's when I really started working on my nervous system in a different capacity, not just to run faster or jump higher, but to work with my interoceptive system, to be more embodied, to feel the signals, to start to make rest safe, to be able to process emotions. And that was really when things started to shift for me in my life, when I was actually able to move out of some of those patterns and then begin working with people that have a lot of that same history.
Yeah. And so for you, like, let's say today compared with a decade ago, what were some of you had mentioned binge eating, workaholism, not able to really be fully present, difficulty maybe in connection. So what are you experiencing now? Like I know for me with the work that I've done, there are moments that would have just completely tweaked me out. And now I'm just like here experiencing them. And I'm like, whoa, this is a freaking miracle, and it's maybe not as dramatic, but it is really dramatic, the difference. And so I'm curious, what are some of those things for you?
That's like the biggest thing, to be able to be present for my life, however it is.
Yeah.
Like I feel alive. I feel here. Like I'm here with you,
Yeah.
And I mean, honestly, I'm a pretty different person from that in so many ways. Yeah. But I will say some of the biggest difference, the outputs that I experience have shifted. I don't remember the last time I binged. I have good boundaries with work. I'm in a partnership we communicate, we show up. I have a pretty high ACE score. And so I had a lot of trouble with dissociation. I had a lot of trouble with physical intimacy. I have autoimmune. And now I can stay present for physical intimacy and emotional intimacy. I process emotions. Like I know how to scream and cry and shake and mobilize things. And I stay in my body. I would check out so much. And I'm here.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a huge gift.
Yeah. It's really, really beautiful. Can you, for those who don't know about the ACE score, would you mind diving into that a little bit more deeply?
ACEs are kind of the original study that helped people start to link adverse childhood experiences with the development of behavioral issues like addiction, but also, big physical health outcomes, autoimmune, cancer, chronic pain. And it was a study done on, I think it was around 17,000 participants with Kaiser Permanente. And there was a guy, Dr. Vincent Folletti, was the original ACE study, originally conducted the ACE study. And he had been doing it actually first as an obesity study. It's not a word that I love, but that's what it was. And started to see that a lot of the participants would respond really well to the protocols, but as they started to lose weight, they either started experiencing some other big outputs or they would reach a point where they couldn't keep going. And then he started digging into their background a little bit more and found that they had, almost all of them had early childhood experiences. A lot of it was sexual abuse experiences, and started to connect these dots. And then eventually with some work was able to get Kaiser Permanente to do this big study. And they started seeing that the higher your ACE score, the more likely you are to have these unwanted health outputs. And there have been many studies since then. There's one from the World Health Organization that applies a little bit more internationally. Looks at like war and community violence. And it just really links it's been a big catalyst in helping us, I think, collectively to understand like the waters that we're swimming in development, shape our nervous system, our stress levels, and then that leads to all of these outcomes later in life. And if you have an ACE score of 6 or higher, there's a truncated lifespan of 20 years, which is a really big deal.
Yeah. It's expected.
Expected.
Unless you do this work.
Unless this is
of
really...
course, we don't know what someone's meant to be in this life and how long they're, but like the work that you do with people, for sure, I know you don't have the data on this, but I would bet my life that for sure the work that you're doing with brain-based and NSI is extending lifespan. Like it would have to.
That's the whole reason that I do this, that I've gone into this world is there's so many people I love with high ACE scores, and there's so many people with complex trauma, and they're beautiful human beings that have so much to offer the world. And I think it sucks that these are the outcomes and that the trauma compounds. And because of everything I know about the nervous system and the brain, I know we're neuroplastic beings. I know adaptation is always possible. And when we understand how our nervous system works, we can work with it intentionally to create change in the way we process information, in our skill of regulation and our ability to process emotions. And when we can do that, it doesn't have to be that way. Like these are not fixed outcomes. Nobody's set any one way in stone. We're super dynamic beings. And I think people just need the opportunity to understand more about how they work and what they can do and have some agency. And then that change becomes possible.
Right. And that it's not always, that it's not an issue of like, oh, you need to work on your mindset, not at least as a starting point. And it's not an issue of like, oh, you need to just change your behavior, at least not as a starting point. Right. And that it doesn't mean like medication forever, though that may be supportive, right? I am curious as you say that, though, the question that came up for me is like, what about personality disorders? Do you have any experience with that? And what do personality disorders have to do with the nervous system, if at all? And is that a thing that can be shifted with plasticity? And I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, that's a big question.
I'm going to dive into it with you.
This is not your area of study,
well,
so feel free to say pass.
I do have a lot of experience with this, and I just want to caveat this by saying, I'm not a licensed mental health professional. People should always consult with their doctors. And in the world of applied neuro, we don't really believe in personalities. So I am hesitant to believe in a personality disorder, right? There's no one fixed way of being. It's a frequently occurring reaction. And I want to understand, or I would love for people to understand, that everything that our brain and nervous system does at that subconscious level is for our protection. These are all protective outputs. It's the way that we learned to survive, not just physically, but also emotionally and socially. And when we are swimming in developmental waters where there's high stress, where we aren't getting our attachment needs met, which is a real survival need, we will come up with ways to adapt. And then those patterns play out into adulthood. And I myself am someone who is diagnosed bipolar, diagnosed borderline personality disorder. I mean, my adolescence was volatile, like I said. And also, like, if you meet me today, I'm pretty grounded, pretty even keel. And so much of that has to do with rehabilitating my nervous system, the patterning of my brain, how I take in information about the world, how I respond to it, what filters am I seeing the world through. And that can be changed. It's possible.
It's so hopeful and so beautiful. I love that perspective. Thank you. I think that's really healing for a lot of us. And also, right, like that's personal responsibility, right? You took that upon yourself to do this work. And so, of course, that doesn't mean that if we are in a relationship that is tricky in that way, that like we can ever force someone else to do it. And I am curious the degree to which this comes up in your practice and with the people you work with. It comes up a lot for in my work with people around their money, where it's like, okay, I'm doing this, but my partner won't come on board, or like, how do I get my mom to do this? Or how do I get my difficult sister to whatever? And it's like, well, so I'm curious, what do you say to people who are like wanting other people to heal their nervous systems?
Yeah, it doesn't work great. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
it's got to come from, it's such a personal journey. And the best thing that I can do is live the work myself, right? And allow people to see the changes in me. And hopefully they will gravitate toward that, plant the seed for some curiosity. Yeah. And if it's there, I mean, especially working with your nervous system, it is a journey. It wasn't like a quick fix to get from point A to point B. And it's not like super sexy.
It's really not. It's like you really want it to be about like the quantum leap where you're like screaming and running across the cold and like you're totally different overnight, but it's not like that.
It's like I'm doing weird things with my tongue or looking in different directions with my eyes and making weird vocal sounds. And it can be like a little bit tedious.
Yeah.
It's a daily practice. It's like taking care of your teeth or getting movement, and it takes time. It does compound on itself, and yes, but so someone has to really want it, and be curious about themselves, and I think also too, the state of my nervous system impacts someone else's. Yeah, we're always responding to each other's nervous systems, so sometimes I have big shifts in relationships because I change. Right. My relationship with my mom is different because I'm different. And it's not that she's necessarily doing neuro work, although she does sometimes now.
That's really cool.
But like when I'm present with her, she has a different level of presence with me, and it creates more space in our dynamic for there to just be something new.
That's so beautiful. Amazing. Yeah. When you showed up today, I was sharing with you that my husband is having a minor, compared to where we've been, but a flare with his skin. And thanks to learning from you, I was like, hey, babe, like, did you know actually that the output of your symptom is not an indicator that like we need to necessarily attack the symptom, but it's an indicator, it's a protective mechanism whereby your nervous system is basically being like, my threat and stress bucket is too full. And so I'm going to give this output of pain, inflammation, discomfort, so that you will take it down a notch and protect yourself and stop getting more stress and threat inputs. So can you explain why that is and what some of those outputs are that people, and like, because our culture is so fast to like give a pill, or like for us, anytime we mention our journey with eczema, everyone is always trying to give us a topical. And it's like, me too. Thank you. And right. Like I'm grateful. And also it gets so much deeper than that, but it's not even deeper on the level of like, oh, it's a food allergy then. Right. Right. It's like, okay.
It's systemic. It's the whole system. Yeah. So simplified version of how we approach the nervous system is really looking at it as input, interpretation, output. And so I'm always taking in information about the world around me through all my different sensory systems, my eyes, the balance system in my inner ear, my body mapping system, my interoceptive system that's letting my brain know what's going on inside of my body, my temperature, am I hungry, am I thirsty? All this information is coming in all the time. And then my brain is taking that information and interpreting it and making a really important decision, safe or unsafe, and then generating an output. And so really everything we start to see is outputs. My pain, my behavior, my relational patterns, my posture, like all the things are outputs from that cycle of input, interpretation, output. Mm-hmm. And so when the quality of my inputs aren't great, then that's adding a lot of stress to my nervous system all the time, because my brain really needs that information to have a clear picture of what's going on in my external world and what's going on inside of me. And so if I can start to work with my nervous system to make that information more clear, more accurate, by doing this practical rehabilitation of these sensory systems, then I'm under less stress all of the time. And then that allows me to now experience different outputs, because when I'm under too much stress for too long, my system is going to start to try to protect me. Mm-hmm. So a little bit of stress is good. We need it for adaptation. But if you think of your nervous system like a bucket, and you think of all your life stress going into that bucket, our systems are quite intelligent, and they know it. We don't want the bucket to overflow. That's too much dysregulation for too long. That's chronic disease. That's inflammation. That's severe mental health outputs. And so your brain, your nervous system, your body will start to generate protective outputs to get you to reduce the water level in the bucket. So pain, for example, is a great behavior change tool of your brain. If I give you some pain, you're going to take smaller steps. You might go lay down. You might call in sick to your high stress job. You might block out all the lights. And now you have less inputs coming in. If those inputs are threatening, blurry, unclear, that's good in that moment for your survival brain to have less, because they're stressing it out. So your system creates an output that's going to get you to reduce the intensity of your life to keep you safe in that moment, because our survival brain is really concerned in the moment. Am I safe? What do I need to do right now to lower the water level in this bucket? And so that could be inflammation. It could be pain. It could be all these different things that we see as outputs.
So what risk do we run by pushing through pain and other symptoms?
Well, what we do, we get better at. And so there's two important things here. One is the SAID principle, specific adaptation to impose demand. Neurologically, it means that's becoming a more well-worn pathway. So my brain's going to start to go to that output more frequently, because it's less energy costly, and it achieves that behavior change goal of reducing the stress. So now it's going to start to take less and less stimulus for me to start to experience that output of pain or whatever it is that I'm trying to move out of. Could be dissociation. And then the other important thing I was going to say about that is what we get better at, and our system is trying to get our attention. It's trying to create change. So if this isn't working, it's either going to have to get louder, it's going to turn the volume up on that output to get what it wants, or it'll switch to some other kind of output. So maybe I push through the pain, but now I'm starting to get vertigo. I'm getting dizzy. It's going to find the path that achieves the result of getting us to reduce the stress and protect ourselves.
Okay. What about, so many questions. This is great. So in my understanding of the nervous system, and one of the things that I describe a lot, and I just really want to get your take on this, and just for context for listeners, I became aware of Elisabeth's work about a year ago and have gone through 3 modules of her certification. Listened to a few podcast episodes. So that's where I'm at. And so a great deal of my nervous system education came beforehand. So I'm so curious about okay, if the way I describe this is the way you would also understand it. So one of the things that I have come to understand is that our nervous system has essentially a thermostat set point, and that thermostat set point is and I'm sure it's connected to the neurotag, so feel free to fill that in, but that it is based on our previous experiences. And so it was kind of the developmental waters we were swimming in, right? So in my environment growing up, there was just a consistent sense of stress and pressure and running out of time and some degree of financial pressure. So that was just like in my development, that was the energy, that was the vibe. So my body developed in an environment where that felt like home. And so when I have, and I've continued to work on this is literally the basis of my work, but when I have experienced in the past greater degrees of calm or stability, because my thermostat setting was to stress and pressure, I would unconsciously recreate any kind of scenario and unconsciously do these behaviors such as overspend or launch too many things at the same time or pull the rug out from my life in any variety of ways to essentially feel that same level of stimulus that made me feel alive. Even though it didn't feel good, it did feel familiar. And so given that, I'm just curious, like, am I missing any pieces from your understanding?
That's very accurate. And absolutely, our brains function on pattern recognition and prediction to generate those outputs to keep us alive. And so our brain wants to know that I'm safe in this environment, and that's what it knows. So it's going to drive us in familiar paths because it knows how to handle this. It knows what to do. It's predictable. And so when something is unfamiliar, even though it might be what you cognitively want, there's less predictability for your brain. And so in that way, it actually feels not as safe.
Yeah, it's such a mind fuck. So, okay. And then, and this is, you were so kind to come as a guest expert in Relax Money. And then we did this coaching call today together. And a similar question came up many times, which is, okay, I'm now out here beyond my previous thermostat setting in terms of my income, in terms of my experience of community, in terms of my experience of manifesting and magnetism and like calling in dream clients or whatever. And now I'm freaking out. Or I noticed myself go into old behaviors. What do I do about that? So when we experience something in our lives that takes us beyond our previous thermostat setting, right, beyond the predictable, and it's technically what we want, but our bodies freak out, our brains and bodies freak out. Like I tell the story a lot of when I was offered my first book deal. I was standing in the lobby of the W Hotel in Union Square. Louise Hay herself says to me, "We would like to publish your book." And it was like this dream moment. And I went across the street to a cafe and I had a complete and total meltdown, like sobbing, snot, completely freaking out. And I was having this shame spiral of like, I would call it a guilt spiral of like, I shouldn't get this because there are so many other people who want it more and I'm wrong and I haven't earned it and blah, 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 blah. Right. So like complete not enjoyment of the moment. And there were a number of other things that happened. And now I understand what was happening and I needed tools, right? I didn't have any tools. So I just sat there and cried. And that was also an effective strategy actually for regulation, totally. Which we can come back to. Actually, that was great. But that's like a practical example of something that happened in my life. I was like, I want this, and yet I'm experiencing it as a threat. So what do we do if we want to expand our reality beyond our previous thermostat and beyond what all the people in our life have ever experienced and all the people in our lineage have ever experienced?
I think one of the key pieces is really intentionally working with our nervous system for presence, right? If I can start to understand my nervous system, understand how it works and how to communicate with it through sensory input, that's really the language that the nervous system speaks. In these little moments, I can help my whole system, my whole being to be more present with what is. And if I do that over and over again, maybe it's just for like a minute a day, I'm giving it some sensory stimulus, I'm allowing myself to be present, that can expand on itself so that I'm able to stay embodied and aware and have all of my systems functioning. And when I have that capacity, and I have really trained those skills for myself. As I move into new situations that are unfamiliar, I have the option now of like a different path, of a different response, because I'm better at sensing into the present moment and responding to what's really there instead of going reflexively into the old patterned path. So part of the reason that I am so diligent about working with my nervous system is because it allows my brain to function better. So I have more fuel, more capacity. I can view my life with altitude. And in those moments where that is stressful, to be in a new situation, to be trying to relax, to maybe receive something, instead of reflexively going into the patterned protective response and the old behaviors, the old physiology inside, I can take a beat and give myself a little bit of space, maybe provide some direct sensory to my nervous system with some tools to keep grounding into that. And then from that space, suddenly more is possible.
Yeah.
And like little by little, those things build on themselves. And I think as you were talking before too, I was thinking about the constantly seeking of the stress. And I do think like homeostatic set point and familiarity is important. And I think also too, though, sometimes being with our body and our internal sensations is very threatening. Dissociation is a protective output that a lot of people experience because the situations were just too intense to stay there. And so that becomes a patterned, well-worn protective response. And if we can stay distracted in all these other ways in our life, we aren't feeling and in tune with those signals, and they might carry a really high threat load. So part of getting out of that pattern too is working with my interoceptive system and in a minimum effective dose, creating regulation and safety around feeling my internal sensations and being able to mobilize and process some of those emotions so that I'm not always having to create all of this externally to not be able to be there with my body and myself.
Yeah. So for someone who's just coming to this work and, maybe they're experiencing a high level of anxiety, which is sort of common, in the world for sure, but certainly for my listeners, or just a high sense of like pressure and stress, or a fundamental like deep feeling of like, I'm just not okay, like things aren't okay and I'm not going to be okay. Where might they start? Like, what does a daily practice look like? Knowing that, of course, everybody's nervous system is so different, but are you spending like hours a day with your, in your practices?
No.
What are some examples of how this might go in daily
So
life?
the thing about NSI and neuro work is that it's really easy to make it very practical. It's, daily throughout the day, taking little bits of time to create regulation and safety. And that can be as simple as some sensory stimulus for your feet, or a breathing exercise, or doing something to get a little bit more fuel and oxygen into your brain, like these little simple tools that are really directly communicating with the nervous system to create a different physiological response inside in that moment. So if we're already coming into the work really overwhelmed, a couple things to think about with anxiety specifically. One is there's a lot we can do at a very physical level to start to address anxiety, so we don't have to reroute all the beliefs, and that takes a lot of capacity to work through.
I know.
To work through all of that. And it can be as simple as I'm a chronic hyperventilator, and that's creating stress all of the time. I might have some sensory mismatch, which is where different sensory systems are communicating differently to each other. Like my eyes have a little bit of a deficit, or my vestibular system. So that's my brain is having to decide all of the time, which one of these inputs do I rely on to make that prediction, to decide if I'm safe and what to do next. And so when those signals are conflicting, it's very energy costly for the brain. And that really produces a lot of anxiety. When I don't have a clear map of where my body is, I'm moving through the world kind of blurry, very threatening for the brain. And so there's all these little practical things we can start to rehab that really do a lot to alleviate the stress load of anxiety. And again, it's not about spending hours a day rehabilitating these systems. It's finding a couple tools that work really well for you and just weaving them in throughout the day, especially when you might start to feel those first subtle signals of like, ooh, I'm starting to brace a little bit, or my heart is starting to race, or I can feel changes in my breath, or maybe I'm dissociating a little bit. Is there something I can do in that moment to regulate, to repattern, and again, just let that build on itself?
So powerful. I was first introduced to an NSI tool last year. I was teaching a retreat. I was leading a retreat. The retreat was a bit of a shit show. Everyone who went to the retreat continues to be in the group saying it was amazing. However, I was having a deep experience of unease.
Anxiety. Yeah.
And a lot of it had to do with the retreat venue. And there was this tropical storm, and the venue was like not well equipped to support my people. And
I have been there.
It was crazy. So Carrie Montgomery, who is how I met you, she's a dear friend of mine. And she sat me down because I ended up rooming with her as it's part of the tropical storm scenario. So there we were in our jammies. So I was telling her that I was having a really hard time, and she led me through this drill. And it was such a powerful, immediate expansion of, oh, now I'm here. And the racing thoughts and the deep sense that things were not okay and that I was doing a terrible job evaporated. And I had had that experience many times from being in nature but it didn't feel quite as like on call and this particular experience was called helical breathing that she led me through. And for me, that's a really high payoff tool, and it just gives me instant access to my full self.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, there I am. And as someone who, historically, I do have a tendency to run anxious, and I have been on medication in the past, to be able to find something, not just that one tool, but any number of nervous system healing drills, tools, whatever you want to call them, that can signal to my body, like, we're safe now, actually all is well, that doesn't require cognitive energy, because our cognitive energy is not enough, or it's not the right input. You can explain it, but it's just basically like the idea that we could change our reality with our thoughts alone is quite misleading, even though there's something to it. So I'd love to hear you talk about what's missing in the concept that if you change your thoughts, you can change your reality.
So there's a lot here. That was a beautiful example. And one of the things to think about in trying to understand, yes, it's really important to think about our mindset and our thoughts, but if we're not bringing our nervous system and our body along with that, that can actually create a lot of cognitive dissonance where what I'm feeling inside is very different from the affirmation I'm saying out loud. So you're at the retreat and you're like, everything's fine. It's going to be okay. I know everybody's taken care of. But inside of your body, it does not feel like everything is fine. Yeah. And that's actually creating more threat load for our brain because it doesn't match.
So affirmations that are not a match with what our body is feeling is actually creating additional friction and potentially making things worse.
Yes. And I would say also too, like eroding a little bit of that like self-trust.
Totally.
Like, no, everything is not okay, and creating more of that separation, just trying to like blunt force push through it. And also too, fuel supply wise, if we're in an activated state in a threat response, most of our fuel and activation is going more toward the back parts of our brain where those autonomic responses are happening. And I don't have as much fuel and capacity to stay in my cognitive mind and my higher order thinking systems. And so it part of our prefrontal cortex job is to inhibit those reflexes. But if I don't have enough fuel and capacity, or if I'm in a big threat or survival response, it's not working the way that it should to inhibit that. So I'm trying to inhibit it cognitively, but the reaction is still occurring inside. And so instead, if I can work with my nervous system, which again really doesn't speak English or French or German or Spanish, it speaks the language of sensory input. So instead of saying to myself, you're fine, I'm going to create new inputs through my sensory systems with touch, with breath, with vision exercises, with stimulus for my inner ear, that is stimulus that my system responds really well to, that gives it the fuel and activation that it needs to be able to regulate and modulate and create a different state inside. And then I'm also driving more fuel and activation to my frontal lobe, and I can suddenly look around and say, yeah, I am okay. I'm okay in this moment. Because again, I'm coming back to the presence, right? The presence through that sensory that takes me out of the survival response. And now I can have a different reaction. And so if I can pair those things together, working with the nervous system, with the body, along with the mindset, it's a much different experience.
How much does it matter that we are cognitively, consciously aware of the content of our memories or our beliefs or our whatever, whoever, as we do some of these tools to unravel old patterning? Like, let's say someone wants to change their money story and they have a history of being rooted in lack. They come from a family that there was a lot of struggle, and they find themselves repeating financial struggle over and over and over again. And of course, always there are larger systemic things going on here. So it's not always just personal responsibility. Right. And we also are always contributing to our scenarios, right? So it's both, right? And they're like, wanting to change their money beliefs. How important is it that we bring to mind the actual limitations or the actual old memories or the actual content as we practice our nervous system drills?
I think sometimes it can be helpful to understand where things are coming from, but you certainly don't have to. There's a lot of people who have only somatic memories of experiences, or like you were saying, it could be collective. Right.
Or ancestral.
We could go back and find so many different reasons for these reactions in our body occurring. And so within SI, we're pretty forward focused. Like we're, again, really trying to stay in that present moment. What is the pattern? How's it showing up in my life now? What can I do to make changes in that pattern in this present moment? And can I do that over and over again through repetition and load to start to use neuroplasticity to make changes in the pattern, to have them stick, so that I'm just moving through the world differently? And I don't always have to go back and understand the source of the pattern or relive the trauma. Sometimes that can actually do more harm than good, because especially if our body, our nervous system isn't equipped to be able to process it differently, right? If I haven't created the skill of mobilizing or emotional expression or vocalizing, I don't have any new ways to process this. And now I'm retelling it, I'm reliving it, I'm just going to get the same patterned response. I'm going to recreate the repression. I'm going to recreate the whole neurotag. My filters of the world might start to change. I'll have that activation inside, and I don't have any way to process it. And so I'm essentially then just re-traumatizing myself over and over and over again. So until I learn new tools or I have more capacity in my nervous system, it might not serve me at all to do that. And then even when I do have that, I mean, personally too, like I have to be careful of like always diving back in and trying to figure it out and figure it out. It's like, I don't have to figure it out. I just have to repattern, rehabilitate, regulate.
That's so, I don't know. I find that really freeing, honestly, because sometimes it just can be so heavy to go back. And it's just
too
like
much sometimes.
Sometimes, I recently learned some things about my grandmother's history. My grandmother has now passed, and it made a lot of sense as to why I had some outputs in my past that some of them have changed without me having to have had that information of, potential patterning that lives in my body as a result of, the whole thing about how the egg that forms us was in our grandmothers at 4 months gestation. So that's like wild.
It is wild.
It's wild. Okay. What I want to ask you about next is meditation. I get asked a lot, or people tell me, oh, I'm already meditating. So I'm doing nervous system work. And I understand that it's actually different and not always for everyone the optimal place to start. What's the difference between meditation and nervous system healing tools?
So this is a great question.
And what are the commonalities?
Yeah. Meditation is a great tool. It can absolutely, it's so useful for so many people. There's lots of science behind the ways that it impacts our brain function, and it's great. And there's a couple of things I see that happen with meditation. And one is that for some people, it is threatening to sit still and to if we're in a state of dysregulation, we're in a state of fight or flight, our body is prepared to move and to discharge and to stress process. And we're trying to sit still. Maybe it doesn't feel safe to close your eyes. Maybe you're in a room with other people. Maybe focusing on your breath or feeling those internal sensations still carries a very heavy threat load and really activates the system into a protective, reflexive trauma response. And so by really pushing yourself to do that, you might feel worse. And that I see it happen all the time. And then there's like this shame of like, I can't meditate, right, and I feel so much worse after. And I would really encourage people to start to be the expert of your own nervous system and assess and reassess what works for you. How do you really respond to that? And maybe it is a great tool, but maybe it's not the right tool for you right now. And we could do some work to rehabilitate the interoceptive system, to help the nervous system get better at modulation. And then it might be a better experience. Or maybe it's just not the right tool. Maybe you need to walk and be present. Maybe your mindfulness practices need to have some type of movement so that there is some stress processing. And then I would say another big difference is I do also come across folks who are kind of using meditation to disconnect from the body.
Totally.
Right? I like this because it gets me out of my body. And that's not where we're going with neurotraining. It's really being able to reconnect to the body, to the sensations that we feel inside, and to restore mobility to be able to actually feel and then process and discharge emotions. I don't want to disconnect from all of that. I want to be able to be with it and to be able to process it. And that inherently emotional regulation and emotional processing, it has to involve some movement. Yeah. Our bodies are wired to express this energy through movement or vocalization or crying or sounds, or there's got to be that component there too. So that we just want to be careful that we're not leaning into meditation as a way to disconnect from ourselves.
Yeah. So you're a very diplomatic person, but I'm curious. I want to know, so you have this top charting podcast, Trauma Rewired. You go deep into the data. You've been doing this work for many, many years in a way that's unusual. Like it's really different than what I've seen out there in the somatics world and in the trauma world. And I want to know what drives you crazy about some of what you hear, particularly on social media, about the way people talk about trauma and the nervous system.
There's a couple of things that concern me.
Great.
Okay. And one is that some of the nuance of the nervous system gets lost. And this idea that this blanket tool is going to be the one tool that will fix everyone and make their nervous system better is not great, because everybody's nervous system is really different. We all have different movement patterns, different breath patterns, different past experiences, different deficits. Certain things are going to be overwhelming to some people that work really well for other people. And everybody's nervous system is so unique, and we need to understand more about our own nervous system. how it works, and how do we assess what's really working for us, and know that there's nothing wrong with you if this tool doesn't work for you. It's just one tool. It's like one bit of sensory stimulus. And I think people try these things and it doesn't work, and it can really reinforce that narrative of I'm broken, or they might start to experience some strong protective outputs from it. And because they don't know how to calibrate, they don't know how to gauge like the right dose of stimulus for their nervous system. And that can sometimes push people into a lot more dysregulation or pain or whatever it is that they're experiencing. And so I think before people just learn all these blanket tools, they need a little bit of understanding about how their nervous system works and how to assess. And then the other thing that I see that is, I love somatics and I love processing emotions, and you see these big experiences and it looks very cathartic and it's wonderful. And there does have to be some capacity there to have these big experiences. And for some people that might work wonderfully. And for other people, it can really leave them quite lost and in a big state of dysregulation, and they don't have any path back. They don't know any tools. They don't know about their own nervous system. And so they go seeking this healing from a big experience, and it can be really unsettling for people.
Like, so that big experience could involve like a hero's dose psychedelic experience, or like a big deep process work, or some kind of big cathartic feeling your feelings event.
Yes.
Is that what you're describing?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And I just get a lot of people that come in to work with us that are left in states of big dissociation, real mental health crisis, suicidal ideation. And it's just these big experiences. There's no preparation before. There's no real plan for integration, like integration at the level of the body and the nervous system after. What am I going to do with this information that came through? What am I going to do with this experience? Is dissociation and emotional repression a well-worn path? And now all of a sudden, this big thing is happening. How's my body going to react after that? And do I have like the support and the tools to be able to navigate through that?
Yeah. Thank you for answering that question.
Yeah.
Okay. So as you know, as we kind of like wrap up here, as you know, I work with people around money and the nervous system. I'm curious, in your work, while applied neuro is like, you know, originating really in physiology and like
Brain
physical
science.
performance,
Yeah.
right? It's brain science, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, might feel like, okay, well, that's like a different topic. But I'm curious, in working with clients, in you know, working with your NSI practitioners, what have you noticed, if anything, in people's relationship to money and work and worth when they invest in working with their nervous system in the way that you teach?
It's really powerful, actually, because all these patterns, they trickle into all areas of our life, right? And we do a lot of work with attachment patterns, relational patterns, and these things show up in my relationship to money as well, right? If I don't have good boundaries, if I don't have the capability to set boundaries, I'm going to be overextending myself, undercharging. I just can't have boundaries around my business because that's all relational boundaries too. And if I don't have the ability to rest and relax, how can I come into a state of relaxed money? You know, if I'm pushing all the time and that feels unsafe, it's really difficult to start to shift some of those dynamics. Maybe also too, there's past financial trauma, stress at that level. And every time I sit down to make these changes, I'm dissociated, or I'm really tired, or I experience a migraine. And so as I start to work with my nervous system, one, I can increase my capacity so that I can handle the stress of making these big changes, of taking new action without the same protective outputs. And then also too, I'm actually starting to change my responses to stimulus, to things. And that could be in conversation with my partner or in conversation with my banker. And the way that my system is responding to the world and in to my own internal state shifts. And that bleeds into all areas of life.
I actually have more questions.
Yeah. I love questions.
I'm like, I thought we were done. We're not. Okay. So something comes up and has come up several times over the last few days with some of my clients. And it's similar, which is like, okay, I made this investment and it didn't pan out the way I wanted to. Maybe I lost money. Maybe it was a large investment in some sort of coaching something or other, and I feel like the coach let me down, or I invested in this mastermind and it had all these promises, and then it didn't, it didn't pan out the way I thought. And every time I think about it, I feel like resentful. I feel constricted. I feel hooked. What is your advice or recommendation to repattern that kind of response to either financial regret or financial resentment?
This is a good question. So one, I would say process some of those emotions. Like first and foremost, let them out. Get yourself a good pillow scream session in,
Yes.
Move around, do the things. And then also too, when we start to shift, like I think sometimes some of that comes from, I'm afraid I'm going to make the same mistake over again, right? And I'm getting stuck in this loop. And I know that if I can start to work with my nervous system, work with my brain to start to shift some of these patterns, that I'm now moving through the world differently. Like I'm a different being as I create these changes in my nervous system. And so I can enter into new containers differently. Yeah. So my experience will be different. I might not go pair up and be in the same relationship with the same type of people because I'm more in touch with my intuition. But also, even if I go into another container that isn't maybe what I want it to be, I'm different. And so there's more that I can get out of it, and there's more that I can take in, and I can also have the skill of hearing my intuition, hearing my internal signals. I can take action when I need to. And maybe that's the experience. I've actually had this experience of now I get to go into something. This time I realize that it's not the right fit, and I get to have the experience of setting a boundary and taking a new action. And like in that moment, I'm repatterning. I'm so doing the thing.
Yeah. I love that so much. What do you think about the nervous system and manifesting? I have a theory. Okay. And I want to know your opinion on it.
I'm really curious about your theory.
My theory is that it's not the more regulated I become, but the more facile in my nervous system. There's a better word for that. It also starts with an F, and I can't think of it, but that's not the word I'm going
for.
Flexible. There's also another one. It might come or it might not, but flexible is good. But the more able I am to move in and out of states of activation and down regulation and up regulation and come back to my wholeness, I have found that the synchronicity in my life is increasing at a rapid pace. From a like, it is an unbelievable the sorts of encounters I have, the ease of communication, the like, oh, literally the moment I'm thinking of that person, they're now texting me. And I had these things before, but either I'm now more aware of them because I'm healthier and more present, or I'm speeding up the rate at which I'm attracting them. I'm not sure. It doesn't really matter. And I just want to know what you think about this.
Well, I think it's very possible to create change like what you're talking about, because I think ultimately, like I said, the reason that I do this is to be present, to be like tuned in to myself. And I think the more I'm tuned in to myself and my instincts, our bodies are communicating so much. We have so much instinct and knowing. But if I'm disconnected from that because I'm in threat response or I'm dissociated, I'm missing all of these signals, right? I'm also not as attuned to you I'm not as present with other people and responsive to their nervous systems. And so as I have a healthier nervous system function, that ability to modulate, to have the appropriate response for the moment at hand, I'm better at hearing and feeling and responding to the signals of real time from another person and from inside of myself. And I really think that that opens up a lot more opportunity to know our truth, to know the knowing, the next right action to take when something is unfolding, to step up and be there for it, because there's so many signals that are a guide, that are coming from other people and coming from ourselves. And there was one other thing I was thinking about that too. I don't know. I lost it.
It'll come back if it needs to. The word that I was trying to think of does not start with an F. It starts with an S, and it is supple.
Yes.
So just in case anybody was wondering, I was trying to go for a supple nervous system. Okay. This has been great. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
What a rich conversation. Thank you for answering all of my questions.
I'm happy to. Anytime.
Of course, I have 100 more, so. But yeah, I think it does need a part 2. I agree. I hope you come back. So where can people find you to learn more, to dive into some of these practices, and to begin their own healing journey?
Well, if you're an individual who's just looking for these tools and a framework to start rehabilitating the nervous system, you can find brainbase.com. If you go to brainbase.com/Kate, we have 2 free weeks.
Amazing.
And I'm on there live. I teach classes. You can do on demand. And then we have the certification program for coaches, therapists, professionals that want to weave this into the great work that they're already doing. And that's neurosomatic.com.
Neurosomatic.com?
Yes.
Okay, great. Neurosomatic.com. Amazing. I love it. Thank you so much. And also your podcast. Trauma Rewired is a great place.
If you're interested in diving into the world of neuro and trauma, great free resource is Trauma Rewired.
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible. The depth of knowledge that you are just giving away for free is mind-blowing. So definitely head over there. It's one of the top-rated podcasts in, I think, the self-improvement category.
Something like
whatever
that.
That means.
Who knows? It's top rated.
Perfect. Thank you, Elisabeth. All the links will be in the show notes.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
What is neurosomatic intelligence? NSI is the ability to recognize how sensory and cognitive inputs affect your nervous system and intentionally shift those inputs to create positive adaptations. This work allows for deeper regulation, improved performance, meaningful behavior change, and trauma repatterning. Learning to work with my own nervous system through NSI has completely transformed my life and my business. I've built resilience, shifted old patterns, and now have tools that help me and my clients thrive. If you're ready to experience this change too, early registration for the next NSI cohort is open now. Don't miss the bonuses. Check out neurosomaticintelligence.com/Kate to learn more.